This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
I hope I got the speaker. Oh, there we go. Got it. Hi, thanks for coming out on this lovely evening, and I'm very happy to be here. I live in Stevens Point, and so I've come to Wapaka a lot, usually in the summertime, but it's nice coming here in the fall. I need that. That's what I need. You know, as you mentioned, I'm the outreach coordinator for ECDC, and I'll explain what ECDC is. It's not ACDC, it's ECDC. We are a new office. We've only been around, haven't been around a whole year yet, actually. Our first anniversary as of the hiring of our director would be about November 15th. So we're kind of heading towards our first year of refugee resettlement in central Wisconsin. So what I'm going to do this evening is talk to you first about, start out kind of globally, talk about the larger issue of refugee circumstances, you might say, on the globe, and then focus into central Wisconsin and talk specifically about our office and what we do. And at that point, then talk about ways that people can help. So kind of bring it down to that point, towards the end of the evening, and then certainly glad to answer any questions that you want to see if I can answer. Let's see what I can do for you. So I do this presentation often with church groups. So I had to sort of make this a combination of things. And so welcoming the stranger is sort of the title I use an awful lot with some of the faith communities that we get involved with. And there's a lot of faith communities that support us, by the way. That's kind of one of our real backbone of our organization. And you'll see why that is as we get further in. So let me go ahead. So the first thing that I like to point out to everybody is when we think about refugees, I'm not sure we think about refugees all the time, but when we do think about refugees, we are at a point right now where there's actually some parts of the globe where there are actually generations of people living in refugee camps. And these camps they're bigger than cities in some places, in some cases. Some of the folks that we often are aware of in refugee situations, maybe like Syria or with Afghanistan, are very recent conflicts. But we have folks, for instance, coming to us from the Congo, to our office, and those conflicts have been going on for decades. And so it's something that's not really on the news that much now in terms of what's going on specifically in the Congo or in the eastern part of Congo. But that's where you'll see that the refugee crisis is something that's continued to kind of grow globally. And images like this, I think, are actually kind of helpful to get people to understand the scale of what's happening on the different parts of the earth. So the UN pointed out just recently that we've reached an historic milestone, and not one to be very proud of or to be happy about. And that is, we just a few months ago crossed the 100 million person mark for displaced people. Now, displaced persons or displaced people is a term used by the United Nations. It's been used at least 100 years. The United Nations, as its form it is now, was created at the end of World War II. And of course, one of the big tasks that they had to take on, which was something started earlier, with earlier organizations after World War I, were displaced people. And what they were looking at specifically in 1945 and 46 were everybody from the millions that were displaced by the Holocaust through the various folks in Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, that were displaced by the war, the movement of the Soviet Army, that sort of thing. So the work of refugees is something that the United Nations has been engaged in daily, since at least 1940s, and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees keeps track of that on a day-to-day basis. And I think we don't always think about this, but the UN has the job of just kind of gathering the data and just keeping track of what's going on in the globe. So hitting the 100 million sort of marker, if you want to call it that, for forcibly displaced people is a real cause for concern, globally. And so when you look at that, when they talk about forcibly displaced, what they're usually talking about are folks who have been displaced by war. That was typically where it started, if you look at back in the 40s specifically, but increasingly It's from environmental catastrophes that have added to the number of folks who are forcibly displaced from their homes. And it is a very important term, forcibly displaced. None of these folks want to leave their homes. They're forced, out of their homes. Environmental disasters, civil war, larger conflicts, economic circumstances can be part of it as well, but generally the UN is looking at talking about environmental and war catastrophe. Over half of that number are what are known as internally displaced. So when they talk about the internally displaced, what they're talking about are people who are still actually within their borders of their country. Okay, so the largest number are still trying to live somewhere near home, and in their home country. So you can even think about what's happening if you're listening to news this morning, for instance, about Haiti, and what's happening in Haiti. There's a lot of internally displaced people in Haiti. Just a small example of the kind of thing that's being counted as part of internally displaced. The over 27 million refugees that the UN designates as refugees, they are external, okay, meaning that they are outside of the borders of their home country. Okay, that's the group that we're kind of focused on with our work, are what are called those 27 million or over 27 million refugees. Now, I do want to pause for a moment to say that the definition of a refugee and asylum seeker has sort of two sides to that term. One side is the United Nations and how they designate the term, and they use it when they're talking to all sort of nation states that are involved in the work of the United Nations. So they have their definition, and folks, they've been tracking that way. Same for asylum seekers in terms of how they use those numbers. And then every country defines legally what it determines as an asylum seeker, and the term is used very broadly. Refugee is a very broad term. So for instance, in our news, sort of cycles, you may hear people talking about what's happening on the southern border, for instance, the United States. That's a whole mix of folks. Some of them do fall under these designations, and a bunch don't. Okay, that has to do, again, with how the UN looks at it, how the United States looks at it, and then when folks get into the country, the United States has a legal process for asylum seeking, which is, again, separate from what the United Nations is defining. So when we look at these statistics, this is the United Nations looking globally and saying, here's how we read it, but every country and region can have sort of variations on that, okay? So again, working with those UN numbers, these are the largest, sort of by country, the top, the top 6 in terms of refugees right now. And do I have a button? Oh, I have a button. Well, I can even push it there. Okay, good. So Syria is still the largest in terms of how the UN is counting it, with almost 7 million. Congo is up around 1 million. Okay, and up here in the middle of around 3 million is Afghanistan still, as of sort of about 3-4 months ago. So these are the biggest ones, but the number of countries that have folks that are considered refugees or refugee status goes down about 30 to 35 countries, and the numbers kind of go down from there. But that's where you get the 27 million from, is when you pull those all together. But these are the biggest ones, on the globe right now. And Venezuela is coming in as number 2. And again, if you read the news over the weekend and things that are going on, particularly the southern border of the U.S. is beginning to see more Venezuelans who are actually people who are designated refugees by the United Nations. Now, I'll talk about what that means versus what the U.S. does. There's a difference, because it's voluntary what countries do in terms of those refugees. But back to the camp situation. So one of the first things I like to point out to everybody is that when refugees are forced from their countries, where do they go? Well, the vast majority end up in the neighboring countries. That's where they end up. So if they're internally displaced, in a country that's really suffering, and then it kind of sort of implodes, gets worse, and they end up in the neighboring countries. And as you can imagine, most of the countries around some of these camps are not exactly wealthy countries. Okay, they are completely dependent on outside help to be able to help take care of millions of people coming into their country. And I think one thing that's kind of worth, at least from my own experiences, when I was doing study abroad work at the university, I spent a semester in Krakow in Poland. And it was a wonderful semester, got to know a lot about Poland. But Poland's not exactly a wealthy country. I mean, it is wealthy by these standards. It's very wealthy by these standards. But it's not exactly a country where things are all in great shape. So for them to absorb millions of Ukrainians, okay, which is what they've been doing, Imagine the stress, on everything from, sort of their national level down to just local communities in terms of trying to help take care of their neighbors who have now been forced into Poland. Same of the other countries, Romania, and they're not Romania, but the countries Czech Republic and those around Poland that are part of that process as well. So the vast majority are in these neighboring countries, and these circles represent simply a way of trying to illustrate how large the numbers are. So the larger the circle, that's just the larger the number of people living in those camps, okay? It's not where the camp is. Camp's not that big. So what you'll see is that the smallest circle on here is already a camp with about 62,000 people in it. And the largest of these circles, again, is a camp with over 184,000 people. So, I don't know, think about the population of the county, Waupaca County, think about the size of like Stevens Point, or, and you're suddenly seeing that this is, Point and Plover and all that, or Madison, that's the size, the number of folks that are living in these camps currently in Eastern Africa. Those are the biggest ones. And again, there's other camps in other parts of the globe, Southeast Asia, for instance, and others, but these are the biggest ones that, sort of being depicted on this particular map. And again, the big problem is that they are forced into the neighboring countries, and then what is kind of the question. Well, the then what usually falls to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, okay? It is the UNHCR that not only keeps track of all the statistics and the data of who is ending up in these camps and where they're coming from, but also takes a lead in coordinating international agencies and any kind of charity that comes in to try to help take care of, as much as possible, coordinates, what kind of aid has to come in to help folks. So not just, making tents or getting tent cities set up. A lot of organizations also help do that. They do that work as well. But everything from that through, food, medicines, are sort of coordinated through the UNHCR to try to help take care of refugees. So they're kind of the front line. Now, in terms of the countries that are the receiving countries in the world, right now the major hosting countries are, and I don't know if this will be surprising for you, there's a couple things that surprise me on this, but first off, Turkey is the largest receiving country right now with over 3.8 million refugees. And I don't know how much you follow international politics and all and what's happening with Erdogan and what's happening in Turkey, but this is a tough situation. A lot of Afghans, a lot of Syrians end up in Turkey, for instance, and it's not a very good situation. Colombia is the next biggest because of the Venezuelan situation. So Colombia has a huge number of refugees. But the one that kind of surprised me was that Uganda gets caught, right in the middle of the same 1.5 million like Pakistan. And that kind of caught me by surprise because Uganda, again, is a small country that really struggles, and we are getting folks coming to us from Uganda, but from other countries in those camps. And so very reliant on other countries to help them host and take care of folks. And then, of course, the one I'm probably proudest of, I don't know why I'm proud of it, but Germany. Germany hosts over 1.3 million. A very conscious decision, primarily under the work of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, to say that we owe this historically, to the world, and therefore kind of took that moral high ground. And, the Germans generally have been very supportive of that, which is pretty amazing, the numbers that they have taken in. So those are the largest kind of receiving countries, and other countries get involved too. So what happens is the United Nations HCR, so the High Commissioner of Refugees, works with all the various countries on the globe to determine, which countries are willing to host, which countries are willing to sort of take folks in, and that's an ongoing process that the U.S. is involved with as well. So let's see here. There we go. So how does that look? I mean, so what I like to talk about, so how does that sort of stack up in terms of numbers? I know these are kind of lots of big numbers to think about with just basic like U.S. Census data. Like what does that look like, for the U.S.? Well, in terms of refugees that come to the U.S., these are broken down by decade, okay? So what happens is, since the Refugee Act of 1980, and that's the most recent set of legislation that determines legally how we accept refugees in the United States. What's the legal process for folks to come to the U.S. That's the Refugee Act of 1980. What you'll see is that basically the United States during the later part of the Cold War and the first decade out of the Cold War, was up around 120 to 130 or 140,000 a year in terms of how many refugees that we would take in. And if you look at kind of a flat line of the statistics on refugee intake in the U.S., since the 80s, the United States has always taken in about 110 to 115,000 a year. That's kind of what we kind of signed up for, you might say. And again, during the Cold War era, we were much more sort of invested in the process. After you get out of the Cold War, though, we really sort of stepped back, for a while and sort of slowed down the numbers for a variety of reasons. But politically, it was just how we were engaging internationally that we kind of backed down a little bit during those decades. And then, of course, if you stacked up against U.S. population data, just to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, in terms of the 2020 data, we have about 6.8% of U.S. citizens who are foreign-born. Okay, so just as kind of a number to think about, almost 7%. And then we have about 6.5% that are non-U.S. citizens. And so if you look at in terms of our population, therefore, we have within that number of U.S. citizens, I should say between those two, are refugees. Now, just an important footnote too. A person, so the refugees who come to us through this process come to us legally. They come under a legal visa status. And then that visa status they come in under is valid for 2 years, but it is a path to a green card. So if they get a green card, that allows a person to continue to live in the U.S. as a resident non-citizen. Okay, that's kind of what a green card basically is. And then they can be in that status for many years as they want to. They can kind of keep reapplying for it. A person cannot apply to become a U.S. citizen until they have resided in the United States at least 5 years. Okay, so in terms of when you look at folks that are in terms of their path, towards citizenship, they can't even decide that until after 5 years of residency. So they do need the green card status in order to even get the residency, in terms of their being in the U.S. So when you look at the overall population of the U.S., non-U.S. citizens make up about between 6 and 7%. Okay? Okay, so how do the refugees come to the United States? How do they actually get here? Well, under the Refugee Act of 1980, the basic process that we follow today is set up. Now, it's not to say we weren't taking refugees before that, because we were. We've always been a country that has taken immigrants and refugees, and we've had different ways we've done it. But this is the process that came together, and part of that process is what's called the annual presidential determination. So there are committees in Congress, okay, and there are folks in the State Department. We'll talk a little bit about some of these State Department offices that are involved. They meet on a regular basis with the presidential branch, okay, with the executive branch, to talk about from year to year how many refugees the United States will take in and which countries will take them from, okay? So like all things, it's political, right? If something is high on our priority list that folks we need to take care of, like what happened in Afghanistan, they jump to the top of the list, okay, in terms of we're going to take people from that country in this coming year, that sort of thing. And so that sort of number gets publicized basically in the latter part of the calendar year. And so we know from a refugee resettlement office, like, okay, what's coming, in the coming year? Like, what are we looking at, for numbers? So the negotiations go on between, the president, but also Congress with the UNHCR. And then within the State Department, you have the Refugee Admissions Program, and you have, which is, basically, that's where we have welcome centers, 5 welcome centers around the globe. And then internally, it's the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration that is technically the one that says, okay, when we decide we're taking these folks from, say, Afghanistan, I'm going to explain why that doesn't quite work. But when we take these people from this country, here's the numbers we're taking. That's the group that actually gets down to the processing of individuals. Okay. So what happens then? So State Department agrees to take folks in, says we're going to take these folks, and they're going to come. Then what? Well, what basically happens is State Department contracts with these 9 nonprofit organizations. So one thing we run into in our office quite a bit is people think that we are the government, and it's like, no, we're not the government. We're a nonprofit, like Catholic Charities, for example, and we work with the State Department to take the refugees. So when they sort of decide on those numbers from year to year, it is representation from these 9 organizations that get together in D.C., and they meet on a monthly basis. All of them have an office, in the D.C. area. And they are going to work out, okay, this month we've got folks coming from this camp or from this particular country. Who's going to take them? Where are your offices around the country? And do they have capacity? Do they have room? Do they have folks who can help take care of them? And that's how they work it out. So you'll see that, for instance, there's probably some names on there that are very familiar to you, like Church World Services or Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services. IRC, those are all biggies. Like World Relief is World Relief, for instance, a big name. ECDC, Ethiopian Community Development Council, we're one of the 9, but we're the smallest by a long ways. And as you can tell from the name, the way we started is that it was back in the beginning of the 1980s with the crisis in Ethiopia that Ethiopian Americans formed an organization to help refugees to come to the United States. So for the first several years, ECDC was an organization devoted specifically to helping Ethiopians. But as they got more into the work and they developed as an organization, they ultimately started taking it more broadly, getting involved with all the other big ones to become, part of refugee resettlement generally. So that by the 1990s, ECDC was actually helping more broadly in the DC area particularly with refugees from around the world. And as one person I met this evening at dinner also, there's branch offices, and they started in the 90s a lot of what are called African community centers in different cities like Denver. And they started sort of working out that way, and then by today we now have sort of what we have with like Wausau. Okay, so in terms of Wisconsin, a couple of important things to kind of know about. So first off, every state is federally mandated to have a state refugee coordinator. Okay, so that's a federal mandate that gets involved with the offices in Milwaukee, works directly with the state government. And that person works then with these nonprofits on the state level. So kind of the conduit politically, but also working with the nonprofits. And so right now in Wisconsin, we've got 2 refugee resettlement offices. They've been around the longest, in Milwaukee. Madison now has sort of restarted up. They've got Jewish Social Services has a refugee resettlement office there. Catholic Charities is hard at it with refugee resettlement in Green Bay. And World Relief is in the Fox River Valley. Okay, and they were the ones that were here. And then we, as you can see, we're the newest. What happened basically is that there was a nonprofit organization in Wausau that was interested in getting involved in refugee resettlement and approached the mayor first, in Wausau, and then they kind of went through politically and got to contact with the state refugee coordinator and at least got Wausau sort of on the radar for refugee resettlement. And on the other side of what happened was in D.C., all of those big 9 organizations were being asked by the State Department to gear up. We've got a lot of Afghans coming. We've got folks coming. Can you build out some new offices? And ECDC agreed to come to Wisconsin, and so was still and open an office. But because they're perched in Washington, D.C., their perspective was, if we're going to open up an office in Wisconsin, we're going to want to go to the biggest urban center, because that's where most of ours are at, so we'll open up in Milwaukee. So they contacted the state refugee coordinator, and she said, we already have 2 in Milwaukee. We'd like you to look at this small town. And so ECDC really kind of has gone out on a limb, one of the very few to actually open a refugee resettlement office in a smaller community. And since we opened, we've always thought of ourselves not just as Wausau, but as trying to be an office for central Wisconsin, because we need all the communities in central Wisconsin in order for us to make it. There's just in order to be able to take care of people. It's a big lift for one community to have to do that. So today, Wisconsin does have over 80,000 refugees in different sort of stages of experiences. And again, in terms of the refugees that settled across the state since 2000, it's been over 16,000. with over 40 distinct nationalities. So it's kind of, I don't know, I think it's pretty neat, actually, that we had such a broad array in Wisconsin. Now, if you stack it up against other states, there are others, of course, take a lot more, okay? And again, typically around big urban centers. So on the coasts, take a lot more. Wisconsin usually gets about 1% of the resettlement of refugees in the United States. So if they say, for instance, we're going to have, 300 folks coming to us from somewhere, Wisconsin might get 3, okay? So it's 1%, that is the number that Wisconsin usually takes in. So what's going on in central Wisconsin and how are we doing this? Well, we started last November, opened our office. Our first families came in, December 28th is when we got our first family. And Adam and I were the two guys, in the office in November as we were kind of gearing up for this. And I always like to point out to people that at that point, we hired one caseworker. We had finally gotten a caseworker to come on board. She drove in from Ohio. It's this young woman. She arrives to move into her Airbnb on December 28th. So the same day we were picking up our first family, our caseworker was moving into her Airbnb so that she could go to work the next morning with a brand new family arriving in Wausau, which she didn't know what Wausau was, before she came. So we started, with a caseworker. But the other thing we did right from the beginning is we created, and this was again a lot thanks to New Beginnings and their work. We created a lot of what were called co-sponsorship teams. So groups from faith communities typically that would agree to be volunteers to not be hosts exactly. I mean, because we have to move folks the refugees into their own home. They can't move in with a host family in that way, but to really host them in the community. So the volunteers are ones who help with everything that the families need during those first several months. But there really are, in a sense, a way to build folks that can become friends and become community for these folks as they arrive. So we had from the beginning, our one caseworker, and then we had several co-sponsorship teams of volunteers to be with each of the families and to help them settle in. But it was a bit wonky, and part of the reason it is because, as we all know, we had the whole situation last year with Afghanistan and what had happened with the whole collapse of the withdrawal of U.S. forces in order to sort of stand up a regime that wasn't going to stand up, and the Taliban took over. So the U.S. military, in terms of Operation Allies Welcome, began to evacuate as many Afghans as possible. And what that did was it created, what they did on the national level is they created what's called the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program. Now what that thing was, and still is, but it's basically winding down now, is it was kind of a way of short-circuiting refugee resettlement for the Afghans who were now being swept up in large numbers very quickly to get them to U.S. military bases for safety. Okay, I'll just take it back. What happened was, and most of us probably are aware of what happened at Fort McCoy, right? You probably heard the news about Fort McCoy. Fort McCoy ended up hosting 12, 14,000 or so Afghans, and that was one of the safe haven bases that were established around the United States. The folks were, again, sort of taken out on military, equipment to get them out of Afghanistan and quickly put first on what were called lily pad bases, so typically in the Middle East or in Europe, and then they were sent to these safe haven bases, and then began the process of actually vetting the folks and making sure that things were all good and how they were going to go forward or whether they would go forward in the United States. That was when they said, okay, now that we've got all these folks on U.S. soil and we've got them in these military bases, how are we going to resettle them? And that was called APA, or the Afghan Placement Assistance Program. The Afghans came, and they were, because they were brought in this really quick manner, they were not given actually sort of normal visa status. Okay, there wasn't time for that. They had to get these people sort of these military bases. So what they were granted was called humanitarian parolee status, okay, which may sound a little strange, but let me explain it a little bit. Humanitarian parolee status is a legal status the U.S. government created a while ago, particularly if there is like a natural disaster. So I think if you go back about 6-7 years ago, again, Haiti, there was a situation with earthquakes and terrible storms, and there was a decision made that there were a whole bunch of folks who had to get out of the way of these storms, and they were given humanitarian parolee status to come to the United States. Now, the whole deal with humanitarian parolee status when it was created is the folks are given that with the understanding that they're going home. Okay, that's why it was called parolee. Okay, well, so we get all the Afghans that get them on over, and they gave them all parolee status, and then they said, oh, we'll sort this out when we get them then out to refugee resettlement. So one of the big crying needs we have right now, and it's a really tough one, is all of our Afghan families, we have some who have like normal visa status, and I won't even explain what that is, but they get like a regular visa status. We have a lot that are now trying to transition from humanitarian parolee to what would be called asylum seeker in the United States, so that can open up a pathway to a green card. So we are actually working very hard to find legal expertise to help our families, the Afghan families. We're getting some help from Catholic Charities out of La Crosse. They do have an immigration law specialist who's helping, swamped, so can't take all the cases. And we're working with a law firm in the Twin Cities that does have legal immigration specialists, and they're helping. But we don't have any legal immigration specialists in central Wisconsin. So we got to kind of start getting some in here to help folks. Not just these folks, but their legal status is one that, again, the federal government said, okay, we're bringing you in. Now we're going to sort it out in terms of who will be under asylum seeker for the Afghans. So it's a little complicated. So our office, basically what happened was, Wausau was approved by State Department at the end of the summer in 2021. When they first started, they said, okay, Wausau's a small community. We'll send you 25 Afghans and then 75 R&P over the year. Now R&P are all the regular placements. Okay, so R&P stands for reception and placement. You don't need to know that. But the idea was 25 special cases, 75 sort of regular. That was going to be the goal. Well, it wasn't. I mean, in December after I was hired, it already had changed, and they said, okay, we can't just send you 25. We got way too many people that we have to settle from the Afghan placement program. So they upped our numbers to 100 Afghans and 75 R&P. And that's what we've been working with since January. It's 100 individuals, just to be careful, because sometimes people look and think 100 families. No, it's not 100 families. It's 100 individuals. Average family size is typically around 4 to 5. Okay, folks, that's more the average size, so you can kind of divide it out from there. The 75 R&P are folks that we're receiving now more. So when we started, lots of Afghans. Now we're getting a lot of folks from other, mainly Eastern African camps is where we're getting. Back in December, where there were 3 of us by the end of December that were in the office. We're up to 9 staff now, and that's kind of where we're holding to try to do our work to help, help the 175. One thing I also find that I need to sort of explain that so folks can wrap their heads around it is it's not a one-time deal. It's not just we're going to get 175 people and we call it done. In order for us to have a refugee resettlement office in any place, basically, given the way it works financially with the State Department and the support that's received, we have to be settling between 150 and 200 refugees each year. Okay, that's what we have to do if we want to have a refugee resettlement office. So we are looking to expand out in central Wisconsin and other communities. Right now we're working in 3 communities. We're working in Wausau, Stevens Point, and Marshfield. Marshfield just came online a couple of weeks ago. But as we continue to develop, we want to be able to make sure that we've got enough communities and community partners, faith communities and like to help us so that we can actually do that and continue refugee resettlement year in, year out. Currently, again, since December, it came down to about 27 households, that we had to establish. Again, our first big groups were from Afghanistan. We've had a couple of families from Syria. We got one big family, 10, from Syria that's in Stevens Point right now. But again, Burundi, Congo, Somalia, those are folks that we've been working with. They all came to us in terms of directly to us from the process that's nationally set up. We've also had 5 secondary arrivals. What those are I love this one. So one morning I get a phone call, in my office in Wausau. I drove from Stevens Point, I get to Wausau, and I get a phone call from someone that says, hey, did you know that an Afghan family just moved into Stevens Point yesterday? And I'm like, didn't hear about that, Well, it turned out that they were friends of one of the families we had settled. We had 2 families in Stevens Point, and the next thing we know, one of them had said, hey, they're taking good care of us. We'd love for you to live with us. And they literally just moved up. And so suddenly we're like, oh my. And thanks to a very kind angel in Stevens Point, and also Catholic Charities, we were able to get them into an apartment, and get that family in. So that's our secondary arrivals. Now, this may seem a little weird, but we have only at this point basically what we're calling 2 Ukrainian cases. And I'll talk a little more about that. The number really we're paying more attention to is the applications through Department of Homeland Security. As far as we're learning from the State Refugee Coordinator, there have been around 40 applications by private folks to host Ukrainian families. And so we're kind of keeping an eye on that because they don't come to us, they're coming to private individuals. So right now is kind of where our numbers are at, and we're up at around the number we're expected to. I did want to tell you a little bit about regular reception and placement, those folks and what they go through. So in order for a person to get sort of what's called a Priority 1 visa as a refugee, they have to do an application process through one of the welcome centers, for their region of the globe. So there's like one for Africa, all right, one office for Africa, which blows me away to think about that. That's not exactly like one for central Wisconsin. That's one for the entire continent. And the application process goes by, again, when they're in the camps, they have communications through the UNHCR. They can begin an application process that's sent to the application site. Then they are vetted, and it takes a couple of years of folks coming from the U.S. placement office to the camp. They have to do medical screening. They have to do a little bit of cultural orientation, which we can talk about. They have to then apply, and again, most of them are going to apply and are going to hopefully, they're usually looking to go to like one of the big cities in the U.S. The folks who come to us through the process are folks who say, we don't care where we go. That didn't sound good. But actually, they don't know where Wisconsin is. Wisconsin doesn't exist in their brains for lots of reasons. I was telling the group at supper that we had this really great young woman who came to us, and she learned about 24 hours before departure that she was being sent to Wisconsin. And she asked the person, from IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, okay, where's Wisconsin, or what is Wisconsin? And the person said, I have no idea, So she asked, very smart, says, could you spell it for me? So she got it spelled out correctly so she could get back and Google it at a computer that was available to find out what in the heck Wisconsin even is. And she's a lovely young woman. But I thought, wow, that was really resourceful of her to do that. But it basically, at the fastest that a person can move through that vetting process is 2 years. That's the fastest. But everybody that's been arriving to us in the last several months, they range anywhere from 8 to 12, 14 years in camp. So like this young woman, she's 23 years old. She's been in the camp since she was in her early teens, like about middle school age, okay? And so right now there's an attempt to try to help some of those folks get out of those camps, but it's taken a long time. So just a few highlights about things that we've been, having to tally up. It's important for us, maybe not for you guys, it's important for us to tally this stuff up because the State Department wants to know exactly, like, if we have volunteer time, how do we quantify that volunteer time and put a dollar amount? It's totally mythical numbers. But, in terms of figuring out, like, how much cash donations have we taken in to help, refugees and how much professional, non-professional volunteer time, that sort of, we have to sort of calculate stuff out. The one thing I'm probably proudest of in this whole thing is that all of our heads of households that are, within process have gotten jobs, and the vast majority have gotten pretty good jobs. I think you all know there are jobs in central Wisconsin. It's one of the things that we can really show folks, and relatively speaking, Housing can be tough here. It's nowhere near as tough as it is for our colleagues that are in like Kansas City or San Diego and some of those places that are trying to settle folks. They're getting jobs at Great Lakes Cheese and Merrill Steel, and we've got a couple of really good employers. And the head of households, we've been able to get them in jobs where they're willing to take second shift, they're willing to take third shift. They're getting around anywhere from 19 to 21 bucks an hour, so they can really support their families. And they are, ready to go. The problem is language. We'll get back to that, but they are ready to go to work. And Great Lakes Cheese has been just wonderful in terms of providing rides and getting these guys to work. And they've asked us for more guys, basically because they know that they're good, they're good workers. We got some trying to get into school, at post-secondary, as well as the kids are all enrolled in schools. We do have one special needs, and that's been a really, that's also kind of related to one of our medically complex cases. But generally, if a refugee has a medically complex situation, there are refugee resettlement offices in large cities that are linked directly to hospitals, and that's generally where they send them. So we've gotten a couple that were kind of a surprise, quite honestly, that they came to us. But I think it's kind of an indication of, but with those overwhelming numbers and what's going on out there, they are looking for us to help step up and take care of folks. And one of them is this little guy. He's 2 years old, and he had to go in for open heart surgery last week down in Milwaukee. They didn't know what was wrong with him in the camp, and he went through the medical screen, and they just said, this little guy is probably not going to live. That's kind of what happens in the camp sometimes, is that, they say, well, he's alive and you can go, on the plane because he's a 2-year-old. Well, they got him over, we got him through his health screening, and they took him down to the Children's Hospital down in Milwaukee. So he's successfully gone through this open heart surgery. He's 2. And you can imagine what his mom had to go through. She doesn't speak English. We found a person who actually spoke her tribal language as well as Swahili down in Milwaukee, if you can believe that. Oh, thank God for those refugee offices down there. So that she had somebody who could kind of tell her what in the heck's going on, with her baby. So the Ukraine situation is one that's on our radar, but we don't. Right now, it's an interesting situation, and it's one that I like to explain at least a little bit to the audiences. Ukrainians, because the war is ongoing, okay, and because the U.S. hasn't, and the UN hasn't figured out where this is going to be headed. I mean, it's bad enough, right? But again, like most wars in their first year or so, the goal is to get people back home. I mean, the goal is usually let's figure out a way for them to get back home, and that's what most people want to do, right? So the Ukrainians are not being brought in under regular refugee status yet. They're actually under humanitarian parolee if they come into the U.S. So they're still kind of in that status. But they're not being funneled into refugee resettlement offices yet. Instead, Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. government is basically looking for private sponsors. And what they did, which there's some logic to it, they basically on the federal level said, given the size of the existing Ukrainian American population and Ukrainian churches and Ukrainian groups in the United States, we could absorb like 100,000. So they just kind of put that number out there and said, we could absorb them, meaning through private sponsorship, through families and churches taking them in. So we could probably do that. And so they have to do a declaration of financial support, which is called the I-134. You could go home, go look this up, and fill out an application and see if you could get a Ukrainian family for yourself. But when you sign that form, you are signing an agreement that you are going to take full financial responsibility for that family for at least 12 months. That's when you sign that line. And so what's happening is a couple of things that we're trying to wrap our heads around. So we're available to help refugees, but during that first arrival, we can't. It's private. It's being treated as a private sponsorship. So we really can't unless something really breaks down. Let's say that some family agrees and brings a Ukrainian family and the whole thing breaks down. Like there's some horrible conflict between the family, the U.S. family, and that's hosting and the Ukrainians. We can bring them in under emergency need. But that's kind of where it's sitting right now as of October and into November of 2022. We suspect that since this war is going the way that it's going, that probably within the next calendar year, there probably will be Ukrainians shifted over to regular refugee resettlement, but right now it's not. It's being done privately. Now there's another force at play in this thing, and that is budget, quite frankly. The federal government is looking out there and is turning to private donations and charities to take care of refugees. And so there is this sort of drive going on at the federal level to say, well, just let private folks take care of the refugees, you know. And it's like, well, without having a local refugee resettlement office, that's asking an awful lot of people, and it doesn't really work, is what we've seen and learned from the other offices. So we're kind of hoping, you know, that within 2023 that Ukrainians are defined as regular refugees for refugee resettlement and they can come through our process. But currently it's still being handled as kind of a private matter, and again, you know, the extension of money is a big question. So what are our ongoing challenges and where we need help? Well, probably no big surprise. Housing and transportation. When refugees come to us, it's our job to find housing for them. That's our office has to do that. So we are working very hard to cultivate relationship with property owner companies. I went and spoke to the Wisconsin Apartment Association 2 weekends ago. You know, we are trying to cultivate relationship with property owners, you know, in places that we can get them in and hopefully find something that's relatively affordable. But as you can imagine, that's pretty hard. One of the tricky things, of course, is the lack of transportation. And so if we do get folks to a place where there are jobs, well, you know, like in Wausau, you've got the business park, you know, and the industrial park. There's not a bus line that goes to the industrial park in Wausau. So we've been kind of trying to advocate on the city level to say, could we just have a bus line that goes to the industrial park? It seems like it'd be a good idea for workers. And so we're hoping to get there at some point. Marshfield doesn't have a bus line at all, you know, so this has been a little tricky. We have a couple of families there, but they do have like a partnership with the city with like a taxi service that is subsidized. So we're trying to work it that way. But really what we're finding with a lot of the families are that when we get the guys working, you know, one of the first things we start doing after that is trying to find if there's cars and if there's car repair shops that will work with them to find a used vehicle that can get them to work. And we've had some luck. A number of the guys have found some cars that are dependable enough to get them to work, and then they carpool, they take the other guys. It's what happens quite a bit. And then, of course, you got to get them legal, so make sure they can pass the test. They did translate the Wisconsin DMV tests into Dari and Pashto for the Afghans, but as I understand from our Pashto and Dari speakers, it was really horribly done. They had to take the test several times to figure out what in the heck was even being asked of them. So, like you and me, right? So, then, of course, another big thing is language learning. We are required to get them into ESL, into English Second Language Learning. The kids, of course, automatically go into the ELL courses at school. But the trick is once we get them a job, if they're working first shift, you know, again, if we're working with a technical college or someone that offers ELL classes or ESL classes, it can be hard because of their work schedule as to when we can get them. So we're trying to find more folks who can do tutoring like in the evenings and work with them. And then, of course, language interpretation services. We pay for what's called Boostlingo. It's a service that I can get a live interpreter on my phone, okay, and then you can work with it. And those work. It works. It's very expensive, though. And so we often try to find, if we can, folks in the local community. And so, for instance, when we were looking for housing in Marshfield, we had a realtor that was willing to work with us and said, hey, we've got an apartment. And so great. And we kind of get over and check out the apartment. And it turns out 2 doors down is a woman who speaks Swahili, for God's sakes, you know. So we're like, wow, okay, you know. And we hired her, you know, as soon as we could to help us with interpretation service in Marshfield. But, you know, we do look for folks in the community that can help us. But we do have services that, you know, we can pay for, you know, but it can get kind of pricey. Now, on the horizon, though, including, you know, sort of beyond the Ukrainian situation, this is what's coming up on the conversations at the federal level and with the state refugee coordinators, is that because of the situations in South and Central America and the mass migrations that, you know, we do hear about, there is an increasing push to normalize some of those countries in the UN system and to designate them as refugees in terms of the UN. Because like I said, the UN up to this point has not treated a lot of the economic instability and the sort of the violent crime that has driven some of these people from their homes in Central America. They haven't treated that as a regular refugee sort of designation. They're now seriously looking at it, and again, so that's going to create a situation where we should start, and probably will, we're being told, start getting refugees actually under RNP who are coming from Central and South America, and that's sort of a new development we're looking at for the coming year. So we're kind of getting ready for that. And at supper we're talking about, I think it was the Foundry here actually has recently hired a group of Nicaraguans, I guess, as I understand it, possibly some Nicaraguans. And we thought that's interesting because it might be kind of a precursor to what could be coming our way. Okay, so how can you help? Lots of ways. So in Wausau and Point and Marshfield, we organize volunteers there to help with all kinds of basic things, which I'll talk about. So volunteers meaning short-term volunteers, long-term. The big backbone thing that we look for is civic organizations and faith communities that are willing to do what's called co-sponsorship. And co-sponsorship is where you get together and an organization can pull together at least 7 people. We usually like to be more like 10 or 12, but a group that can then really sign on for 9 months to take care of a family, okay? So not all of our refugees are going to get a co-sponsorship team, but if we can get a faith community that will agree to sort of pull together and then I'll do training with them and do some basic training to create a co-sponsorship team. It's an organized group of volunteers for a family. So that's one of the big things we really push for. And then, of course, we always need monetary donations. I like to point out to everybody that there has been a pay increase from the State Department as of about 2 weeks ago. Refugees this is the only money they get. So no matter, from the State Department, all that, no matter what you hear out there in the world, refugees receive $1,275 once to pay for everything for the first 3 months they're in the country, okay? So that's rent, utilities, food, and if you just pay for your security deposit on your apartment, you're pretty much shot through that money right there. So when you get a big family, actually you got a pot of money. We go, oh, big family, we get a pot of money, we can kind of pay bills for a few months. But when we get these individuals, like I got a young guy who's living with me, well, it's not living, he's living next door to me, but I take care of him. That's all he's got, So what we try to do is to find donations to help to pay month, like at least 3 or 4 months of rent for them, so they give them a little more of a sort of a landing strip, so they've got a little bit of a chance, to be able to cover their bills while they're looking for a job. And then my favorite picture is back again, but so we really look to the co-sponsors, these teams that to come together to help us. They really are helping us because really these co-sponsorship teams take on a lot of the work of a caseworker. A lot. They're kind of like the caseworkers. They're the ones that are right there because they're the ones that are the eyes and the ears, with the family on a daily basis and hear what's going on and what their needs are. And so we really look to the co-sponsors and volunteers for that. And that's that direction. But in the other direction, we really look to our volunteers and co-sponsors to help, in a sense, get the word out to their broader community that these refugees are generally very hardworking people. They come from all kinds of different backgrounds. They're resilient folks. They're great members of our communities. And we want our communities to have like a positive relationship. And the volunteers are the folks who really have that relationship in their community to talk about that. And so it is support beyond the initial arrival. We need help on arrival, for everything from picking up at the airport through getting their first apartment set up. So we look for volunteers for that. But it's also carrying on beyond that, as much as possible. Okay, that's a lot I've been plowing at you. So we started with a lot of statistics and then all this. But if you want, we could put up the lights and we can see if you have any questions. And glad to talk. Thanks. You've got the mic.
So if you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone so that everyone can hear what the question is.
Well, I've got one. I'll start. You joined with the group that was existing in Wausau. My assumption is that they had experience working with Hmong families. So what kind of lessons have you learned from that?
Okay, yes. So what happened was the Hmong, it was the Hmong experience in Wausau that actually really inspired these churches to get involved, this time. Am I still on?
Yes.
Good, okay, I just heard a beep beep up here and I thought, was that me? And so, as you know, I mean, some of you know or remember this, I mean, Wausau did make the national news in terms of what happened when the Hmong families were there 30 odd years ago, and it wasn't good, right? I mean, it wasn't good. And here were some churches who really put in a lot of good work to help these families. So they were really kind of the backbone to help form that group called New Beginnings in Wausau. And that's how I first learned about all of it, is that I started hearing about this effort in Wausau before ECDC was even, kind of on the radar. And then when ECDC agreed to open an office, that's how I got involved. Did I answer your question, by the way, Ann?
I just wonder if there's any examples of things that you learned from working with them, what to do or not do.
Oh, so what to do or not to do. So I think this is something we're still learning. I would say we're still learning from that experience. There was a lot of initial enthusiasm with when the Afghan situation kind of took form and was at Fort McCoy. And I think New Beginnings have tried to really capitalize on that energy. The thing that really went wrong was that it was then months and months of lag before families were actually coming into the pipeline and getting them linked up with volunteers. So one of the things that we're learning not to do is letting people become disengaged. If they're really interested and they want to get in volunteer, we will try to find ways to get them so they can be involved as soon as possible. And not say, yep, got you on the list, and then they wait 3 months and don't hear anything. So there's a real level of volunteer organization that we're still sorting out, and I think that's what I'm worried about. The other one that I think we worry about a lot, is volunteer burnout. It's so intense those first weeks and months with the refugee family. That we're just trying to find better and more ways to keep getting support to those teams so that they don't get quite so burnt out, because it can be really overwhelming. I mean, it's what I've noticed with every co-sponsorship team is that once that family arrives, actually is in their presence, they all suddenly become mother hen. I mean, and I do too, by the way. I mean, this is suddenly their children, and even the grown-ups. I mean, this family is theirs. And so they worry about them 24 hours. And we try to tell them from our office, don't worry about them. They've got a roof over their heads. They're not burning the house down. We're getting food for them. But that anxiety that comes with that intense first experience, because you're working with folks who, they've never been in the United States. They haven't been to a winter in Wisconsin, and so there's a lot to worry about, right? So that kind of trying to figure out ways that we can not work volunteers so that they don't burn out is something we're still trying to work on too. Good question.
Yeah, a couple quick things. One is I assume you would try to move 2 or 3 families from the same country together, not like one family from the Congo into a community if there's no others. And 2 is, are there any examples now? I mean, could family or families come into a town like Waupaca, or does it have to be a larger community?
Well, no, great question. So to use Marshfield as an example right now, okay, 2 things. So we'll use Marshfield as an example. We had a lot of churches come together in Marshfield who wanted to get involved in co-sponsorship and refugee support, I should say, generally. So we were able to create 3 teams, which meant we can move 3 families there. And that was kind of what we wanted. We wanted to have at least so that you could have 3 families and coming from the same area. So we aren't quite there. We have 2 families from the Congo that now are in Marshfield, and that's kind of our goal. You're right. You're absolutely right. We don't want people to be isolated. And that's still pretty isolating, but we want to make sure that you can at least have enough folks so that they have some other folks that at least have some understanding of their cultural background and some cultural common ground. And so the other thing I'd add to that is we have the capacity basically to get a caseworker. The basic rule of thumb is that we shouldn't be placing families beyond 50 miles of our office. And so we're trying to develop out capacity in Stevens Point as well as in Wausau so that our office range can expand a bit, from the 50-mile radius. But the key thing is we've got to make sure that we can support those families. So, we do want to look at Wapaka, as an example of where we'd like to go. But the things that we're going to be looking to do before we take a step is, jobs first, just to know what it looks like with the employers, and we'll have to have those conversations with employers. Is there a level of community support to be able to create some co-sponsorship teams, or at least get us to like 3? And then the third one is what would be the general reception within the community? So I go and give talks, for instance, like in Marshall I did this, where I went and talked to the city council, I talked to the county board for Marathon County and for Portage County and for Wood County. We do the same thing over here, just to make sure that there is a fair public hearing from folks in the community to know that, hey, we're looking at resettling refugees. How is the community going to respond? And what I can tell you, though, is what's been really heartening is that the county boards, they've raised some pretty hard questions and really fair questions about refugee resettlement. But at the end of the conversations, they've all been like, but we know this is a good thing and the right thing to do. So they've always been supportive with a caveat, right? They're like, we want to be supportive, but we got to make sure we've got the resources to help these people. So that's what we'd be doing here in Wapaka, too, and looking for.
I have a question, not regarding these population of people, but we've, in this area, we've had Mexican migrants come in for many years, and most of them come with green cards.
Yeah.
So after 5 years, those people can apply?
After 5 years of residency within the United States, they can apply for citizenship. Now, a lot of folks within the immigrant communities don't necessarily want to go for citizenship right away. There's a couple of reasons for it. One is the expense, quite honestly. It really, for folks to successfully navigate that process to move from a green card to citizenship, they need a lawyer. They do. But there's also, when someone's under a green card, for instance, they have a social security number, they pay taxes, they pay for the same kind of things we do. So honestly, even though they're not a citizen, they're still a contributing paying member of the community. So they kind of look at it and go, okay, when would it make sense for me to go for citizenship? That sort of thing.
And the expense. Now, do they have to reside here for the full year? Because many of our migrants go back to Mexico for 3-4 months.
Yeah, they have to show residency for 5 years, meaning 5 full years. So if they are so if they are going back and forth, which again I know a lot of folks do that in the immigrant community, they're probably looking just to stay in green card status. They're not in a hurry. That kind of thing. So one of the things we want to do, though, if we can get there as an office, is I commented earlier. We want to build up capacity to do legal aid, for immigrants as well as refugees. It's something that if we did that, we could actually, the Bar Association allows offices like ours to do legal assistance, but it is with real restrictions. You got to do it only for your clients, and you got to, so we could actually start offering, and because there's nobody else in central Wisconsin that actually does immigration legal assistance for like the paperwork they need to do, because the main course they have to go to are in Twin Cities or Chicago for, green cards, but also for citizenship. We'd like to be able to offer that assistance maybe in a couple of years.
You need to speak to our new pastor
at
St. Mark's Episcopal Church, because she's an immigration attorney.
Awesome. I want her card. I want her card now. We have, it's so funny, I'm working downtown Wausau, right? And there's the big Dudley building, which we always joke about the Dudley building as the one symbol of Wausau. But there is a whole floor of lawyers in there that's all just like a legal aid assistance group. None of them do immigration law. And so we're like, please. But yeah, I would love to be in contact with her because she will understand exactly what's going on. Yeah.
There are some of us that have done ESL work in the Wapaka area. Rather than, if we don't have somebody coming here, can we go to Stevens Point or Plover to assist, at least in volunteering with some of the activities like ESL?
Yes. So the ESL needs are pretty big, and Portage County Literacy Council is doing a great service helping us. But they are looking for more tutors through the Portage County Literacy Council. They're kind of our main conduit in Stevens Point. We're all for recruiting people to help that way because what you'll find typically is if someone is helping with ESL, they learn an awful lot about the person and their family, and they do end up forming friendships and actually helping them, so we know that that's what happens. But we just do need more folks to help with this ESL tutoring, and I'd be glad to put people in contact with Portage County Literacy Council.
Coming.
Got one here in the front.
Well, all I can hear is how much you have learned. I was minorly involved with a family that came here, the Hmong family. Well, first thing, the children could speak English right away. And so I communicated with them. And they let me know when they moved to Wausau. And I thought, because they had a group, there were a group of them that I thought, oh, that is wonderful.
Yeah.
No, it was not wonderful, but you've learned so much.
Yeah.
Don't apologize for it, and just explaining all that it's never simple.
Yeah, really good. Thanks for the comment. It is. I am so amazed by these folks, in terms of, and what I'm seeing with a lot of my teams, a lot of our teams is that, we, meaning us, me too, we don't have to deal with public benefits and social services on a daily basis as poor people do. Well, imagine being somebody who's impoverished and doesn't speak the language. And so what happens is our volunteers are going into like the W-2 benefits meeting, or they're going into these, and they're like, oh my God, how complicated this is and how hard it is and how long it's taking. And it's like, yeah, because they're overwhelmed, So even that piece is such a learning piece for us. Yeah, so thank you.
So in the native country where the refugees are coming from, do they voluntarily go to these camps, or is there somebody there that's organizing and recruiting them to come to the camps so that they can go somewhere?
So I'll give you an example. The young man who lives next door to me arrived. He's 23 years old, and I got him settled in and started just asking some basics. We're talking about this over dinner as well, about not prying in people's lives. They have traumatic stories, so you don't want to pry, but you do need some basic information. And I asked him if he had family, and I asked him his family. So he quickly, he's better, and he's from the Congo, so he speaks French, so it was really challenging my French. But we were communicating that way mostly, and he said, well, my mom, is still in the camp. And I said, do you have any siblings? Well, I have 7 siblings. And I'm like, how old are they? Well, the oldest one is 17. So he basically came to the U.S. as to be like the first one to get over. So I just said, how did you end up at the camp? And he basically said, oh, my father was killed in the Congo. My mom basically fled the country, and that's the only place that would take them in. So they tend to end up in the camps because there's no other place to go. And because you have these refugee waves that come into a poor country like that, that's when they will informally start creating communities, right? That's what typically happens. But that's where the international groups, and then if the government of that country gets involved, they will try to set up camps to sort of give them a place to go to. So it's not a recruitment. It's totally forced displacement. Good question, Gary.
What kind of support have you gotten or interaction with veterans organizations, many of whom should understand the refugee situation?
Dan, that's a great question. So Fort McCoy had all kinds of veterans organizations who did a ton of work with the Afghans that came over, and then I've seen a lot of individual, but as far as veteran organizations, I haven't worked with any directly yet, and I think I ought to, especially after the conversation you and I have been having today, because I think you're absolutely right. I try to make the rounds to reach out to all the civic organizations and faith communities, and I just got to start hitting up the veterans groups. I think that's a great idea.
County Veterans Service officers would be a good connection for you in each of the counties. So.
Great, thank you. That'd be great, thank you.
I recently read that the refugees in these large camps, that less than 1% of them are resettled, and I wondered if that's information you have.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You know, actually, it's absolutely correct. So what happens, what they call, okay, so I do this in my training, right? Is the United Nations has what's called 3 durable solutions for refugee resettlement. The first one is return them to their home country. So hopefully the one durable solution is the conflict ends, the crisis ends, you can move them home. Second durable solution is you create more permanent residence for them in the neighboring countries. And the third durable solution is refugee resettlement. 99% of the refugees are dealt with in those first 2. It's only 1% of that whole number that ends up in refugee resettlement. So that's spot on. And that's been borne out by various studies.
The other question I have that I read about was that some of the refugees that arrive here, one of the first things they have to do is repay for the airfare that brought them here. And I was
You are
wondering
well
if your
informed, by the way.
refugees are-
Ma'am, you are well informed. Yes, you are. Yes, so they do. So what happens is, and this is always like a shocker for us, I mean, for my volunteer teams, I explain to them, so they get this $1,275 a head, right? You know, that's for the State Department. But when they come to us from overseas, it goes through what's called the International Organization of Migration, which has been around for a very long time, longer than the 40s actually. And that is an organization that does all the booking of their flights, that kind of stuff. But the deal with that is, with IOM, is they get all their paperwork together, they get them on the flights, they get them here, they got to repay the airline tickets, okay? Now, the way it works is they get a 12-month grace period, okay, so they don't get paid during the first year, and then they put them on a payment plan starting, you know, in month 13. So that's how they do it. And so we make sure, because one of the things we have to do is we have to help the refugees understand their finances. That's like a big challenge trying to figure out, you know, how to understand how to pay your internet bill in Wisconsin. You know, we kind of get their finances figured out, and we tell them, as we're working on finances moving forward, okay, if this is what your rent is now, and this is what your utilities are, you know, you got to build in that you're going to need money for that airfare bill. You know, it starts on month 13. So, yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of a shocker to us, isn't it? But that's how it works. That's how it works, and that money goes in the IOM in order to buy tickets for other refugees. It's a whole process that pays for itself, you know. But it's like, oh my word, you know. So some of our volunteer teams have kind of offered to want to help pay, you know, that bill, but we tell them you can do that, but that's actually down the road, and we really try to tell them don't create a situation of dependency. You know, try to make sure that however you do this, there's a sense of independence here and not them feeling beholden to you. So all that gets caught up in that. Yeah.
On the bright side, or on the sad side on that, as a mortgage broker in the Chicagoland area, I did loans for people. Do not pay those things off. They show up on your credit report. So I was working with a lot of Eastern European Bosnians, for example.
Yeah.
And that airfare loan was on the credit report. And that built up his credit score. So don't pay those things off. Pay them on a monthly basis.
Yeah, do the payment schedule. Great point.
Probably time for this
it's funny you say
one
that
more
'cause
question.
Yeah, because we do talk about like credit score for them, and like, how do you explain credit score to somebody who's trying to, you know? So, yeah.
This is going back to the refugee camp, especially that giant one that you had on the screen.
Yeah.
I actually don't understand what goes on there on a daily basis. Is there work for the adults? Are the children in school? Who's feeding them? Who's providing everything?
Yeah, no, wonderful question. So there are a couple of really wonderful documentaries like available even through YouTube that I could send your way. Deutsche Welle did a great one on following a family from camp all the way to the United States, you know. So there's things like that we show you. But to answer your question, when those camps form, they start very informally, and the main thing first is tents and food, which again typically is international agencies trying to do that. But very quickly there's international agencies trying to set up schools to help the kids. And then work is really tough. It just depends. Most of the folks who've come to us have said that, worked in agriculture. You know, some of them, they were able to find work that way. some of these function basically like little cities, right? And so we have had a guy who was a butcher, and he had his butcher shop in the camp, you know, and so was making a living of sorts doing that. So formal, informal economy shapes pretty quickly, and then schools are created, and the kids go through the camp schools. It's real hit or miss, though. What we've seen with some of the kids is they've come over with a little bit of education. We've had some that have been very well educated for different reasons, and some that came and they were listed as having gone through school, and they had no alphabet, no literacy at all. So it really runs the gamut in what happens in the camps. And the families, you know, like one thing we've seen is a lot of our kids that are 13, 14, 15 years old are often the ones left in charge of the family while the mom and dad leave for the day to go work in some fields or agriculture. And so we have a lot of 15, 16-year-olds who are basically the ones that have been running the household, you know, so they arrive here, and now mom and dad don't have a job, and they're the ones who have been taking care of the kids, you know, and they're kind of caught as adults. I mean, they're teenagers, but they're adults, you know, what they've been having to do for a number of years in the camps.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all.